Welcome back to this most important lesson for the day, looking at the American Revolution. Now, in an American history class, I don't guess there's any lecture more important than talking about how the United States came to be. This is not really going to be a presentation on the war itself so much. We'll finally get to the first battle of the Revolution, but this is really more a presentation about why the English colonists decided to rebel at all. That was really the revolution, is the change in the hearts and minds of these proud English colonists. I've subtitled this The Battle for Englishmen's Rights because that's really the theme throughout this story. This is a struggle between different concepts of what an Englishman's rights really were, what people in England are saying that English people have the right to, and what American colonists are saying, because they don't feel like their rights as English people are really being honored. Now, at the outset here, I have to say that it's very perplexing to some people to understand why these colonists would want to rebel. After all, they've just won the French and Indian War. England is supreme in Europe, and they had the freest society in Europe. At least they were proud. The English people were proud that they respected individuals' rights as much or more than anyone else in Europe. And American colonists believed that as well. English people, for example, showed their respect for individual rights by saying that individuals had a right to trial by jury. If you were accused of a crime, then you get to have your case heard by a jury of your peers. And so there was one way that the English showed their respect for individuals' rights. Or another way was in property rights. Governments do not have the right to just come and take your property from you without due process, without your being represented by that government to collect taxes, things like that. So the big question here is, why did these English colonists, living in a society that respected individuals' rights so much, why did they become so disenchanted with their government shortly after this successful French and Indian War? Well, I'm glad you asked that, or allowed me to ask it. That's what we're really going to be looking at today. We'll be looking at several crises in the 1760s, early 70s, that helped bring about this American Revolution. By the way, if you paid attention to the theme music for today, I had one of my other favorite bands there, Def Leppard, always a hit with me. And the song was appropriate, Pour Some Sugar on Me. There's a sugar act that's going to be part of the initiation of some of this disenchantment with English government. But before we get into the specific crises like the Stamp Act and Townshend Act and Tea Act that will help lead to war, we need to talk a little bit about what the English colonies were like overall, how Parliament had been involved or really not involved before. So we turn there now. First, let's talk about the way the British ruled in their colonies. This term here, mercantilism, is a good term to understand. Mercantilism simply was the system by which the British ruled their colonies. And what it means is the whole idea of mercantilism is that the home country should benefit from their colonies. The only reason for a country to own and possess colonies is if they're going to profit from it in some way. It doesn't make any sense if it's going to be costly for them or if it's going to benefit some other country. That's mercantilism. The colonies exist for the benefit of the home country. So one way that the British had upheld this principle of mercantilism was through a series of navigation laws. And this goes all the way back to when the English and the Dutch were rivals for trade and involved in war. the transfer of New Netherlands into New York. Those were the beginnings of navigation laws. And what those laws basically said was that English colonies should trade with England, that their goods coming from the English colonies should be traveling on English ships, and they should trade first with England. They shouldn't carry on direct trade with some other country. Now, it may be profitable for people of South Carolina to just take some ships, go directly to the Caribbean, and maybe trade with some Spanish um, colonies there, or the French. But the navigation laws say you're supposed to trade first with England. And England may re export things to the Caribbean, but England is supposed to benefit from the English colonies. That's mercantilism. And that's what the navigation laws upheld. So ultimately, Parliament has not been very involved in the colonies. They've had more of a hands-off approach to colonial developments. We see that in the fact that every one of those 13 colonies had some sort of representative assembly on their own. In Virginia, they had the House of Burgesses. In Massachusetts, they had town meetings and a general court elected by their own people. Again, these did not supersede Parliament, but they basically made local laws and collected local taxes, and Parliament didn't have to be involved directly at all. In fact, Parliament really was not involved much even in enforcing these navigation laws. Now, there wasn't just one set of navigation laws. They came in various forms from mid 1600s into the mid 1700s. All kinds of restrictions on who the English colonists could trade with, what goods are going to be limited, what goods are going to be taxed. But all of that could be bypassed through smuggling. If colonists just decided to trade directly with the French or the Spanish or the Dutch anyway, and not go all the way to Great Britain to be, to have the goods taken in there first and taxed, then you could avoid all those taxes by smuggling. And English authorities didn't really crack down on this smuggling much. In fact, a lot of the people that were supposed to be regulating trade in the colonies, well, they live back in England. They're not even really in the colonies inspecting. And they're more than happy to just accept a bribe and look the other way while this illegal smuggling trade goes on. The colonists, that's what they had kind of gotten used to. The British had a hands-off approach when it came to governing the colonies. But all that changed at the end of the French and Indian War, 1763. Now Parliament was more involved. Now Parliament made this proclamation line that says, do not cross over the Appalachian Mountains. You'll end up in wars with Indians like Pontiac. Parliament's getting involved in other ways. They're starting to impose more taxes. Parliament hadn't imposed any taxes in the past. Now they're actually imposing taxes for the purpose of raising revenue, not just the purpose of regulating trade. And they're really cracking down on smuggling too. Now, I mentioned the Sugar Act just a little while ago. The Sugar Act is one of these very first taxes. It was really somewhat a follow-up to an earlier act called the Molasses Act. The Sugar Act was not a new, really high, exorbitant tax on sugar-related products. It actually brought the tax level down from what the Molasses Act had been. But the difference was with the Sugar Act, now they were going to really clamp down on smuggling. They weren't going to have tax collectors who really just live in England and accept bribes to look the other way when colonists want to trade directly with another country. No, now the Sugar Act says you are going to pay this small tax on sugar trade, and you must follow the restrictions of navigation laws. And if you don't, you will have a court date with the military courts, the courts of the Vice Admiralty, they called it, naval court. You won't have a trial of jury of your peers. So the Sugar Act certainly catches people's attention. It's the first time there's a tax on the colonists. It's not just for the purpose of regulating this trade and making sure all trade comes through Great Britain. Now, the specific purpose of this Sugar Act was to make money so that England could pay back the debts from the French and Indian War. Now, that was a problem, but the bigger crisis is coming the very next year. We're going to start with the first big conflict with Parliament being the Stamp Act crisis. In 1765, Parliament issues this new law called the Stamp Act. Now, this is not a tax on trade. This is not just tariffs for goods coming and going. This was a more direct tax on all kinds of paper products that are unavoidable. The Stamp Act was a tax on, basically you had to have your all kinds of papers stamped. If it was a court document, if it was a marriage certificate, death certificate, sales receipts, all kinds of official papers, court transcripts, all have to have official stamps, have to be on stamped paper. And so this is not a tax about trade. It is a tax about making money for England to pay its debts. Now, the colonists didn't like this Stamp Act, even though there's something very similar in England, and people in England are being taxed much more heavily than the colonists were. They don't like this act at all because, again, much like the Sugar Act, this law says if you're trying to avoid this, if you're trying to open up courts or bypass the Stamp Act in any way, you don't have a jury trial, you have a military trial instead. Now, you might be thinking, why would England, who's very proud of its respect for individual rights and its practice of jury trials, why would they not allow jury trials in these kinds of cases, violations of the Sugar Act or the Stamp Act? Well, part of the reason was they didn't think that a jury of people from Massachusetts would ever convict someone from Massachusetts. They don't really trust those juries to make a fair judgment. So they say the only way to get a real fair trial is through the military courts, the naval courts. Of course, for these English colonists in America, that sounds like they're not really being treated with the same kind of respect that English people are supposed to be treated with. Their rights as Englishmen are being violated. Well, it's also the Stamp Act crisis that brings out a whole argument about representation. You've surely heard this expression, no taxation without representation. Well, this is when Americans really start that chant, is with the Stamp Act. A lot of colonists are saying Parliament has no right to impose this Stamp Act because we are not represented in Parliament. Parliament can oversee trade. Okay, they can have navigation laws and they can try to make sure that the colony benefits the home country. That's well established. But Parliament has no right to impose a direct tax on the colonists or any kind of tax for revenue because colonists are not represented in Parliament. No taxation without representation. Remember, another way that Britain showed their respect for individuals' rights was this idea that government can't take your property from you without some sort of due process or without you being represented in that government. Well, here's a classic case of where Americans and people actually living back in England are having different definitions of what respecting individuals' rights is really about, what an Englishman's rights really are. They have different definitions of what representation means. To most Americans, they think representation means someone actually comes from your area, your county or your district, and they go and represent you at the House of Burgesses or a general court in Massachusetts. And that's actual representation. Someone has to come from my part of the country, and then they go and they sit in the assembly hall and they vote for things with my interest in mind. Most English people, though, back in England itself, thought in terms of virtual representation. They didn't really say, only this person from my district represents me. They said, every member of parliament represents every English person in the realm. So when Americans are saying no taxation without representation, a lot of English people are saying, of course you're represented. We have a parliament, and every member of parliament represents every English person in the realm. That's even the colonists. But many colonists, of course, complain, no, there is no way you ever can represent us. There's 3,000 miles between us. You don't live here. You don't know our interests. You cannot fairly represent us. Virtual representation is not good enough. Well, the Stamp Act crisis, this imposing of this new stamp bill, it led to colonists really uniting together to oppose this bill. Now, this is crucially important here, okay? I want you to understand the irony. 9 of the 13 colonies meet together at a Stamp Act Congress to decide what they're going to do about the Stamp Act. And there would have had all 13 colonies represented, but some of these colonies have a royal appointed governor, and he calls Congress into session. And if they weren't in session, then some of these colonies just didn't have anyone to send, or the governor, the royal appointed governor, would prevent them from attending. But basically, this Stamp Act has united the colonies. All 13 oppose it. 9 of them actually get to go to this meeting, and they decide to boycott British goods. Now, here's part of the irony. The French and Indian War did not unite the colonies. Remember Benjamin Franklin's Albany Plan of Union? That didn't really unite the colonies. Colonies were pretty separated as they fought against France, and that threat of France did not really bring them all together. Now, the thing that has united the colonies like nothing before is a bill from Parliament, the Stamp Act. And the way that they oppose it through a boycott, this is ironic too, because remember, the whole theory of mercantilism says your colonies are supposed to benefit the home country. They're not supposed to be so crucial to your trade that you rely on them purchasing products. Most people thought of colonies as something you extract raw materials from there. You cut down trees or you extract, things that are grown there, and then they're sold worldwide. But no one really anticipated that the colonies are actually going to be a place that England depends on to sell things to as well. And so they are a big market for merchants in England. If all Americans have decided we are boycotting British goods, then that is really going to be felt by English merchants. They're going to lose money. This is a huge portion of their trade. So it's kind of ironic. These colonies, if you thought in terms of kind of a growing up metaphor. These colonies are not really just children completely dependent on a mother country. They're growing up. Maybe they're like teenagers. They're kind of quasi young adult, uh, semi. We don't want to say independent yet, but they the mother country depends on them much more too to be purchasers of things, not just suppliers of raw material. So Stamp Act crisis was really an eye-opening event here, 1765. This has changed the relationship between Parliament, the whole English government, and the colonies. Well, the end result is there's going to be enough British people who are affected economically by this boycott that they even say, we've got to stop this, end the Stamp Act. And so there's a big argument in Parliament. Some still think, of course, they should impose the Stamp Act because the colonies still have to pay their fair share. They have to pay for the French and Indian War, and they're not even paying as much as people in England are. That's one side of Parliament that they're going to argue. But there's another side of Parliament that would say they're right. These colonists are right to say they've never been taxed by Parliament. Parliament doesn't really have a right to tax them for revenue, and we should just go back to the way things are. Things were before. The end result is the Stamp Act was repealed. It was humiliating for Lord Grenville, those who first introduced this bill, but to take some of the humiliation out, they insisted we also pass this declaration, a declaratory act. Now, this is not a new tax, it's just a statement. The statement says Parliament still reserves the right to tax. So the end of this whole crisis is the Stamp Act is removed, but while it's removed, Parliament still gets to lecture and say, you haven't won the argument. We still have a right to tax you for revenue. We're just removing this one odious act from Parliament. Well, things calm down a little bit, but right on the heels of the Stamp Act crisis is a new act, the Townshend Act. And this is the idea of a member of Parliament named Charles Townshend, and he thought this will be much more acceptable to the colonists because this is not a direct tax. This is going back to just having taxes on imports and exports, which they have had in the past, navigation laws, Molasses Act, all those kinds of things. But Charles Townshend thought this specific tax on trade and certain goods will also help Parliament make some money and help pay for the debt from the French and Indian War. So they use the term indirect taxation. You can avoid this if you don't want to pay taxes because there's an extra fee on trade in tea. Then just don't drink tea. Don't buy any of it, and you've avoided paying the tax. Well, Townshend might have thought that this is going to be more acceptable, but now the colonists are really challenging any act of Parliament whose purpose is to raise a revenue, not just encourage or discourage certain kinds of trade. So there is still opposition to the Townshend Act, not as united as it was against the Stamp Act, because in fact, the Townshend Act duties, the tariffs or taxes on these specific items, was actually very low. Now, wrap your head around this. If you're like me, when you're a kid, the teacher has to make things pretty simple. So the simple story is just to say taxes got so high that these American colonists had no other option other than to just rebel. The taxes were so crushing. Well, if you read some of the pamphlets against the Townshend Act, you'll see that's not really true. It's not the amount of these taxes that was the problem. One of the most famous pamphlets written against the Townsend Act by a man named John Dickinson. And Dickinson says people should pay attention to this tax because it's so low. The Townsend Act should grab your attention because the amount of tax is so low, it should grab your attention. You might think it's nothing because it's so low, but no, you ought to be questioning, why would they even have such a tax? Because it can't raise very much money. Why even bother to just raise that little bit of money? Well, John Dickinson's point was it's to establish a precedent, that the British want to establish a precedent that you will accept Parliament's taxes for revenue. And if you'll do it for this tiny amount, then we can raise that amount over time. John Dickinson thought this is a matter of principle. It's not about the amount of money. It's about the principle. Does Parliament have the right to tax the colonies for revenue? John Dickinson thought, no, they do not. Do not cooperate with this Townsend Act. But, it was so low, it's really tempting for a lot of American merchants to go ahead and cooperate because, if some of your competitors are boycotting, but a few are still importing British goods, then, you have a monopoly. You're the only one selling British goods. The opposition to the Townsend Act was not really as united as the Stamp Act opposition was. And here's some other things to keep in mind about the Townsend Act. What this money was supposed to pay for, the Townsend Act duties, was supposed to help pay for the cost of the royal governor, the actual leaders of the colony, supposed to help pay the governor's salary, and it's supposed to help pay for military costs, the costs of keeping the redcoats supplied and fed and protecting the colonies. Okay, that's important. This is another reason for opposition to the Townsend Act. You see, royal governors have already gotten their salary from taxes from the colonists. Virginia's House of Burgesses would raise the money and pay for the governor's salary. That already happened. Now, this Townsend Act says we'll just collect that money in a different way through trade. We'll collect that money from the colonists, and that's how the royal governor will be paid. You may be thinking, well, what's the difference? If it's somehow money that goes to the governor's pocket anyway, what do I care if it's raised by me through my colonial legislature or whether it's raised through a Townsend Act taxes on trade? Well, the issue is about influence. If the governor depends on these colonial assemblies to raise his salary, he better be in pretty good standing with them, don't you think? He would have to cooperate with the colonial legislatures, or, they could say, oops, we didn't raise your salary this year. We didn't raise enough money to pay you. Having the governor's salary paid through the Townsend Act would mean the governor does not really have to satisfy his own colonial assembly. You see, it's a matter of influence. Who's paying the bill? How is this money collected? Colonial assemblies would still like to have that little bit of control over the governor. If the governor's paid by the Townsend Act, then colonial assemblies really have no trump card to use against a king-appointed governor. That's an issue. The other one, the military costs. Think about this. The French and Indian War ended several years earlier. Who are these soldiers there to fight against? Soldiers that are stationed in Boston, or there are some in New York. What are these redcoats doing in these colonies? They're not there to protect against the French. That threat's gone. They're not fighting Indian wars, if they were there to protect against Indian invasion, they would be out on the frontier. They would be out beyond the Appalachian Mountains, but they're not. They're in Boston and they're in New York. A lot of colonists are coming to the conclusion these soldiers are not here to protect us. They're here to watch us. They're here to keep us in line. So they resent these costs. You just take the soldiers home and let colonial assemblies keep paying governors like they always have. There's no need for this Townsend Act. Well, it's in the midst of arguing over the Townsend Act that the Boston Massacre takes place. I have to move myself so that you see the image here. The Boston Massacre was a fight that happened in 1770 between some town folks in Boston and a group of British soldiers. Soldiers are there supposedly to protect the citizens there, but there's been growing hostility. There have been some people getting into fights with soldiers. And on this day, a little boy they're showing no respect for soldiers either. They're mocking them, calling them names. And one soldier kind of strikes at a kid, and the kid's going to run off yelping, and he's going to tell mom and dad. Family's going to come, and other people in town are going to come and show their anger at these soldiers. What are you doing here? We don't want you here. And a crowd of people really presses in against this group of soldiers. It's March 1770. It's still winter in Boston. There's still snow and ice everywhere. And a lot of the protesters now are picking up snow and ice, and they're hurling it at the soldiers. Soldiers are backed up against their sentry post until they open fire against the crowd. Now, this is a little art piece done by Paul Revere, who was a silversmith and quite an artist too. And he's done a pretty good propaganda piece here, because what he's showing is the soldiers firing deliberately into a crowd with their captain behind them yelling fire, intentionally taking life here. Now, that's why Paul Revere and other Sons of Liberty like Sam Adams, John Hancock, several others are going to be saying this was a massacre, a Boston massacre. Now, that word is kind of loaded. When we think massacre, we might think hundreds of people killed. No, there were 5 people killed. But it was British soldiers leveling their rifles against British citizens and shooting them down in the street. There's many more that were injured, but 5 die from this Boston massacre. Well, that was enough to end the Townsend Act. Parliament decides we must get rid of the Townsend Act because it is such a contentious point. So let's remove it, or let's at least remove most of it. The Townsend Act duties are removed on all except one product, the tea. There was still a small tax on tea. So again, that was kind of Parliament's way of saying we still retain the right to tax. Well, things calmed down for a little while, from 1770 to about 1773. Things are a little more quiet. But then the final crisis comes up with the new Tea Act. Now, this is different than the Townsend Act tax on tea. Okay, the Tea Act 1773 is not a tax. I repeat, it is not a tax. The Tea Act 1773 was an act that was made to save or rescue this big company, the British East India Company. That many members of Parliament were invested in this company. The Tea Act basically says the British East India Company can sell their tea directly to the colonies. They don't have to go through any middleman. They don't have to use a colonial merchant to sell the merchandise. They can just bring their ships in and sell it directly to the colonists. So the Tea Act actually makes the cost of tea cheaper. In fact, it might even be cheaper to buy it through the British East India Company now than it would be to smuggle tea from somewhere else, carry on illegal trade somewhere else. So it's not going to be the cost of tea that's bothering people. That's not what's going to drive them to rebellion. If we were so concerned about the cost of coffee and tea, there would already be raids on Starbucks everywhere. I'm not really much of a coffee drinker, so I'm never taxed by Starbucks. But obviously, we're okay paying higher prices for certain things if we like them. This was a matter of principle again. By having this act, it's like the colonists are going to help save this company that a lot of members of parliament profit from. And this is supposed to teach you will still accept a tariff on tea. And this is supposed to cut down on smuggling. Colonists are not accepting this, or at least many of them have decided, no, we're still not going to accept this principle. So some tea ships pull into Boston Harbor, and the royal appointed governor was insisting these ships be unloaded and the tea start to be sold. But townspeople and Sam Adams, John Hancock, the Sons of Liberty are insisting this tea must be taken away. The ships have to just leave. Well, when they came upon the deadline, one of those two things has to happen. The Sons of Liberty just boarded the ships and threw the tea overboard. They dump all this tea into the harbor. That's the Boston Tea Party. Now, this time, Parliament isn't going to back away like they seem to in the Stamp Act crisis, the Townshend Act crisis. No, this time, after the Boston Tea Party, Parliament gets tough. Parliament imposes what they called the coercive acts. This is what you must do to coerce your unruly teenage children. I got teenagers, so I'm picking on them right now. You've got to coerce them to do the right things. The coercive acts would include things like, we're closing the port of Boston until all of the tea is paid for. Now, that punishes more than just the couple of hundred people that dumped the tea. That's punishing the entire city. That punishes the entire colony and really the whole region of New England. But that's part of the coercive acts. Nothing comes in or out of Boston until all this is paid for. Then they would also have other coercive acts, like no more town meetings in Boston or anywhere else in Massachusetts. Those only breed discontent. It's just rebels talking about what they're going to do with one another. So no more freedom of assembly, no more town hall meetings. Now these are the kinds of things that colonists felt like these are intolerable. We won't put up with this. Another of the acts, I'm remembering something I should have mentioned earlier, but one of these acts said that if a British soldier is accused of some crime in America, they're not going to go to trial in America. They'll come back to England for trial. No fair trial can be had in America. Well, here's what I should have mentioned earlier, so I back up a little bit. After the Boston Massacre, the soldiers who had fired into that crowd, they did get a trial, and a very prominent American actually defended them. John Adams, future revolutionary leader and future president. John Adams defended those soldiers, and he argued that they really acted in self-defense, that the mob was an unlawful assembly, and they were pressing against these soldiers, and the soldiers shot into the crowd, and that was unfortunate. But John Adams says it's not exactly like this picture shows. It's not with Captain Preston behind his men ordering to fire. John Adams was successful in that case. He actually got um, the the men. They were not going to be hung for murder. There are a couple of men that get their thumbs branded, for having shot into the crowd, but uh, nothing worse than that. So Adams believed that justice had prevailed. He had helped these men win their case. But now, part of the intolerable acts or coercive acts say that um, that British soldiers wouldn't have trials in America because you can't get a fair trial in America. Don't you know, John Adams was thinking, I just got these guys off after the Boston Massacre. They're not in jail now, or they're not executed because of it. Of course, people in Massachusetts can give people a fair trial. They'll just hear all the facts of a case and they can make a fair judgment. Well, other acts followed. This was not technically part of the intolerable acts, but it was something else the colonists thought was intolerable. The Quebec Act. The Quebec Act increased the size of what the British were calling Quebec, basically made Quebec incorporate a lot of land beyond the Appalachian Mountains. So this is lands that the American colonists were expecting to move into, and now the British are saying that's going to be part of this section of Canada we took called Quebec. And in Quebec, because it was still populated by French people, Parliament had decided Catholicism can be the official religion in Quebec. They will tolerate Catholicism there. Well, for a lot of English colonists, that was a sign Parliament has lost its mind. It's completely gone against what English freedom, English liberties used to stand for. Remember, there's a lot of animosity, a lot of prejudice between Protestant and Catholic. And for most English Protestants, they would think Catholicism is everything that we're not. It's hierarchical and it's, ruled by a single man. And so for Britain to accept Catholicism in Quebec, to make it the official religion there, seemed like a step away from what Parliament and what England used to be. It was just another sign to these colonists that this is not the Parliament and this is not the England that we have loved in the past. This is not a liberty-loving England. It's a tyrannical, authoritarian England. Well, move my face once more here. This is moving us toward the first conflict, and this is where we'll end here. The first conflict that actually starts the Revolutionary War, after hearts and minds have been changed. The first battle is battles of Lexington and Concord. And many of us have at least heard stories here, know some of the figures involved. Paul Revere is one of those figures. Paul Revere was a silversmith, but he's also most remembered by people now for being a man to go out and sound the alarm that the British were coming. Okay, there's a famous poem by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow that says, "Listen, my child, and you shall hear the midnight ride of Paul Revere." And throughout the poem, he's sounding the alarm. The British are coming. The British are coming. Well, that was what a poet says in the 19th century. He's not directly quoting Paul Revere. He's not there. But the thing that would be very odd, if that was really the phrase he was using, is if he was riding through Lexington and Concord and saying the British are coming, the British are coming, he would get a lot of strange looks, because the people he's riding by, their houses, they would be saying, we are British. We're very proud to be British. No, Paul Revere was probably riding through saying things like the redcoats are coming, or the regular army is coming, something like that. And people would know what he's talking about. The point is, all of these colonies were very proud to be British. They believed the British respected individuals' rights. better than any government in the world. They're very proud of their government. But through a series of events, 1763 into the next decade, in the early 1770s, now a lot of English men and women in the colonies were feeling like we're not being treated like English men and women. We're no longer being treated like we are British. Okay, we'll have more to say about the revolution coming up. Thank you for your attention. Hope that you enjoyed this. Bye-bye.